The morning started the way mornings always do out here. Quiet, slow, the kind of stillness that makes you believe nothing could go wrong. I remember I had my coffee in one hand and the feeding schedule in the other. The birds were just starting up. The light was coming through the trees in that soft, pale way it does before the heat settles in. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. And then I turned the corner toward the primate recovery enclosure and I stopped walking. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stood there, completely still, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Because lying on the ground inside that enclosure, in the space where 3 orphaned gorilla infants had been spending their nights, was Buddy, our golden retriever, a 9-year-old dog who was supposed to be on the other side of the facility, sleeping on his bed near the staff entrance. And he wasn't pacing. He wasn't disturbing anything. He was just lying there, perfectly calm, his breathing slow and even, and pressed against him, all 3 of them were the babies. I want you to understand something about those 3 infants before I tell you the rest of this story. When they arrived at our rescue center 6 weeks earlier, they were in a condition I don't like to describe in too much detail. They'd lost their troop in a sudden violent incident deep in the forest. The exact circumstances were unclear when they came to us. What was clear was that these animals had experienced something that had broken something in them. All 3 were underweight. 2 of them had minor physical injuries that were already healing. But the damage that worried us wasn't physical. They wouldn't eat. They wouldn't move on their own. If a person came too close, they'd press themselves into the corner of the enclosure and go completely still. Not aggressive, not crying, just still, like they'd decided that stillness was the only safe response left in the world. I've worked with traumatized animals for a long time. I've seen what fear does to a young primate who no longer has the protection of a troop. It's not dramatic. It's the absence of things, the absence of curiosity, the absence of sound, the absence of any movement that isn't purely defensive. When an animal stops being curious, you start to worry. When a baby animal stops being curious, you start counting days. We tried everything the right way. Soft voices, minimal handling, consistent presence. We adjusted lighting, adjusted feeding times, brought in a wildlife behaviorist who'd worked with orphaned gorillas in 3 different countries. She sat with them for hours over 3 days. They tolerated her presence. They didn't respond to it. The smallest one, we'd started calling him Little 3 because he was the 3rd and the quietest, hadn't made a single sound in 11 days. Not one. I don't remember exactly when the gate latch on Buddy's side of the facility started sticking. It was one of those things that gets added to the maintenance list and stays there a week too long. I know now that the night before I found him in the enclosure, it hadn't clicked shut all the way. Buddy had a habit of nosing at gates, not to escape, not because he was anxious, but because he was the kind of dog who simply wanted to be wherever people were. He wasn't a working animal. He was just a presence. He'd been around the facility since he was a puppy, and every animal we'd ever worked with had at minimum learned to ignore him. No one saw him go through. No one heard anything unusual during the night. What I was looking at that morning was the result of however many hours had passed between when he got through that gate and when the sun came up. I don't know exactly what the first few minutes looked like. I don't know if the babies made sounds or if Buddy moved slowly or if there was any kind of adjustment period. I only know what was in front of me. He wasn't nudging them. He wasn't playing. His tail wasn't wagging. He was doing something much quieter than any of that. He was simply being still in a way that apparently meant something to 3 animals who had spent the last 6 weeks being afraid. I stood at that fence for a long time before I went inside. I watched the smallest one, Little 3, shift slightly against Buddy's side. Not startling, not pulling away, just adjusting the way any sleeping creature adjusts when it's comfortable. And then he went still again. Here's what I kept thinking, standing there with my cold coffee and the morning birds going on behind me. I had a list of things we hadn't been able to give these babies. I had a plan, a timeline, a set of benchmarks that we were already behind on. I had a behaviorist's recommendations and a veterinary protocol, and a very serious understanding of what it meant when orphaned gorilla infants stopped responding to stimulation. And somehow, a dog with a slightly broken gate latch had done in one night what none of that had managed in 6 weeks. I didn't understand it yet, not fully, but I knew enough to not go inside and end it. I took a step back from the fence. I wrote one note on my clipboard, "Do not disturb," and I went to find someone to fix that gate latch, not to close it, to make sure it stayed open. The days that followed moved in a rhythm I hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. Every morning before the rest of the staff arrived, I'd come in early and check on them, not to intervene, not to document anything formal, not yet, just to look, just to make sure what I'd seen that first morning wasn't some fragile temporary thing that had already dissolved in the night. But it hadn't dissolved. Buddy was there each morning, settled in the same general area of the enclosure, and the babies were near him, not always pressed directly against him the way they'd been that first day. Sometimes they were a few feet away, moving slowly around the space in that tentative, low-to-the-ground way that very young gorillas move when they're cautious. But the distance was never more than a few feet, and whenever one of them drifted too far, past some invisible boundary that only they seemed to understand, they'd stop, look back at Buddy, and return. He was an anchor. That's the only word I have for it. The eating came first. On the third day after we'd made the gate arrangement permanent, one of the staff members, a young woman named Carla who'd been with us about 2 years, came to find me mid-morning with an expression I didn't know how to read. "They ate," she said. "All three. Not everything, but they ate." I asked her how much. She held up her fingers about an inch apart. "I know that doesn't sound like much, but you have to understand, for 6 weeks those babies had been accepting maybe 30% of what they needed. We'd been supplementing through other means, doing everything we could to keep their nutrition at a level that would hold them. 30%. And now they'd eaten, voluntarily, with something close to what I'd describe as intent." The behaviorist, when I called her that afternoon, was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "Don't change anything," she said. "Whatever you're doing, don't change it." I told her what we'd done. What Buddy had done. Or rather, what Buddy had simply been. There was another pause. "That tracks," she said finally. And then she explained something to me that I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said that what those infants needed, more than stimulation, more than enrichment, more than any behavioral protocol she could design, was proximity to something that wasn't afraid. A primate infant in distress is reading its environment constantly, scanning for threat signals, for stress hormones, for the behavioral cues that tell them whether the world is safe or dangerous. Human caretakers, no matter how experienced, no matter how gentle, carry their own tension into those spaces. We're trying, we're worried, we're monitoring, and infants pick up on all of it. Buddy wasn't worried. Buddy was just Buddy. He didn't have a protocol. He didn't have a timeline. He lay on the ground and breathed slowly, and the whole length of his body communicated, in whatever language those babies could read, that there was nothing in this particular space worth fearing. Over the next several weeks I watched something happen that I still find difficult to put into words without feeling like I'm overstating it, though I know I'm not because I saw it happen. Piece by piece, day by day. Little 3 made a sound. It was a small sound, a soft, low vocalization, nothing dramatic, but I happened to be nearby when it happened, and I stopped what I was doing and I just listened to it. Carla was a few feet away. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We were both afraid that if we reacted too strongly we'd interrupt something. Then the middle infant, we called her too, started to climb. Not high, not with any confidence. She got about 2 feet off the ground on one of the lower structures in the enclosure, and then came back down immediately. But she'd done it voluntarily. She'd decided to do it. That decision, that small, private, unremarkable decision to move her body upward for a few seconds, was everything. The largest infant, the one we called first, took the longest. He was the one who'd been most withdrawn from the beginning, and in some ways I think he'd carried the most weight of whatever they'd come through together. But about 3 weeks in, I watched him do something I hadn't seen any of them do since their arrival. He played, not with the others, not yet. He found a piece of enrichment material in the enclosure, a short length of rope we'd put in as part of the standard setup, and he picked it up and dropped it. Picked it up, dropped it. He did this maybe 4 times, and then walked away and sat down beside Buddy, with the same calm, undemonstrative quality the others had, like nothing significant had happened. But I was gripping my clipboard so hard my hand was white. He'd played. These things happened gradually, and they happened because Buddy was present for them, not participating, not encouraging, not doing anything a person would point at and call a behavior. He was simply there. He let them be near him. He didn't flinch when 2 climbed partially over his back one afternoon. He didn't react when first, experimenting with his own confidence, grabbed briefly at Buddy's ear and then released it and moved away. Buddy opened one eye, assessed the situation, closed it again. But time doesn't stop because a good thing is happening. Time keeps moving, and with it the animals you're caring for keep changing, because that's what you want. That's what all of this is for. You want them to grow. You want them to become what they're supposed to become. And as the weeks pushed into months, I began to notice something I'd been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. They were getting bigger. First, especially, his movements were changing. The way he held himself when he moved through the enclosure. The way he interacted with the other 2. There was a quality emerging in him that I recognized from years of this work. Not aggression, not yet, but the early shape of something. An awareness of his own size, a testing quality in how he used his body. He was becoming a gorilla, and one afternoon I watched him stop about 6 feet from where Buddy was lying in his usual spot, and instead of walking over and settling down the way he always had, first just stood there, watching. He stayed there for almost 2 minutes, long enough that Carla noticed and came to stand beside me. "What's he doing?" she asked quietly. I watched first tilt his head slightly, watched his eyes move from Buddy to the enclosure around him and back again. "I think he's deciding something," I said. He didn't approach. He turned and walked to the far end of the enclosure and sat with his back partly toward us. That night I stayed late going through my notes. I found the entry from the first morning, "Do not disturb," and I sat with it for a while. 6 weeks from now we had a decision to make. The habitat expansion we'd been planning for months was finally ready. A larger space, a more natural environment, room for them to develop the way gorillas need to develop. It was everything we'd been working toward, and Buddy couldn't come. The morning of the transfer, I got there before sunrise. I told myself it was practical. There were logistics to manage, coordination with the habitat team, a checklist that genuinely needed my attention. All of that was true, but the honest reason I got there early was that I wanted a few minutes in the enclosure before everything changed, before the day became official and procedural and irreversible. Buddy was already awake when I arrived. He was sitting near the enclosure gate, not pacing, not anxious, just sitting in that way he had, the way that always looked less like waiting and more like simply being present in a place. His eyes tracked me when I came through the door. His tail moved once, slowly, and then was still. The babies were awake too. First was moving along the far wall in long deliberate circuits. Two was sitting near the center of the space, watching him. Little three was closest to Buddy, closer than the other two had been in recent weeks actually, and he wasn't moving at all, just sitting, quiet. I stood there for a while and I didn't write anything down. The transfer itself went as well as these things can go. The habitat team was experienced and careful, and the process had been prepared for over several months. The timing, the method, the specific sequence designed to minimize stress and keep the three infants together at every stage. There were no complications. There was no chaos. There was also on the part of the animals almost no visible reaction. That sounds like a good thing. In practical terms it was, but I want to be honest about what it felt like to watch first walk into a transport crate without looking back, and then two, and then after a long pause near the gate, little three. He stopped at the threshold. He turned his head once, not toward me, not toward any of the staff, toward the spot on the ground where Buddy usually lay. Then he went in. I watched the transport move down the path toward the new habitat. I stood at the fence until it was out of sight. Then I went and found Buddy, who was sitting exactly where I'd left him, in front of the now empty enclosure, and I sat down on the ground beside him. He leaned against my leg slightly. That was all. The weeks that followed were, professionally speaking, a success. The gorillas adapted to the new habitat faster than we'd projected. The space allowed them to develop natural behaviors that the smaller enclosure simply couldn't accommodate. Climbing, territory exploration, more complex social interaction with each other. First's physical development accelerated noticeably. Two became the most adventurous of the three, spending long stretches in the upper reaches of the habitat's structure. Little three remained the quietest, but even he began to show a confidence in his movements that hadn't been there before. We monitored everything carefully. We noted every behavioral milestone. The reports we sent to our partner organizations were, by any objective measure, filled with good news. Buddy went back to his usual life around the facility. He greeted staff in the mornings. He slept near the entrance in the afternoons. He was, to any outside observer, exactly the same as he'd always been. But I noticed he spent more time near the path that led toward the habitat, not walking down it, not trying to get anywhere, just sitting at the near end of it sometimes in the late afternoons, looking in that direction, with the patient, unfocused expression of an animal that isn't waiting for anything specific, and yet isn't quite ready to be anywhere else either. I didn't make too much of it. I noted it, and I let it be. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 4 months after the transfer, when everything I thought I understood about what we'd all been through rearranged itself completely. I was on the far side of the facility when one of the younger staff members came to find me at something close to a run. His name was Daniel, and he was not a person who ran unless there was a reason. "The East Gate," he said. "You need to come." I want to be precise about what I felt in those seconds between his words and my first step, because I think it matters. It wasn't panic exactly, but it was the feeling that lives just beside panic, the feeling of knowing that something has gone outside the boundaries of what you'd prepared for, and not yet knowing which direction it's gone. The east gate on the habitat enclosure was standing open, not wide open, not broken. The latch had been disengaged. We found out later that a maintenance visit earlier in the day had left it improperly secured. A different gate, a different latch, years later, and it had swung inward a few feet on its own. Enough. First was outside. He was standing about 30 feet from the gate, in the open ground between the habitat and the main facility path, and he was not, in that moment, behaving like an animal in distress. He wasn't charging. He wasn't vocalizing. He wasn't moving in any direction with urgency. He was standing completely still, because Buddy was there. Buddy had been on his usual afternoon route along the facility path, the same route he'd walked every day for years, and he had simply come around the curve at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you choose to look at it. He was standing about 15 feet from first, and he had not run, had not made a sound, had not done anything except stop walking and remain exactly where he was. The two of them were looking at each other. By the time I arrived, 3 other staff members were already positioned at careful distances, close enough to respond if they needed to, far enough not to escalate anything. No one was speaking. Everyone understood, without being told, that whatever was happening in that 15 feet of open ground between a 9-year-old golden retriever and a young male gorilla was not something that would be improved by human intervention. I stopped beside Daniel and I watched. First took one step forward, then another. His movement was slow in a way that wasn't hesitation. It was the deliberate, weight-shifted movement of an animal that knows exactly how large it is, and is choosing, consciously, not to use that size as anything other than itself. He stopped about 4 feet from Buddy. Buddy did not move. I want to tell you that I knew what was going to happen next. I want to tell you that some part of my experience, all those years of watching animals and learning their languages, gave me certainty in that moment. But that would not be the truth. The truth is that I was holding my breath in a way I hadn't held it since I was a child, watching something I didn't have words for yet. First lowered himself slowly to the ground. Not all the way, not the full, settled drop of an animal at rest. He went to one knee essentially, and then straightened slightly, and stayed there, looking at Buddy from a shorter distance than he'd covered in the preceding 4 months from inside the enclosure. Buddy's tail moved. Once, slowly. First reached out, and this is the part I have replayed more times than I can count, the part that still catches me somewhere behind the sternum when I think about it. He reached out with one hand, not quickly, not with any urgency, and he rested it on the ground about 6 inches from where Buddy was standing, not touching him, close enough to touch him, and then he was still. Buddy lowered his head and looked at that hand for a moment. Then he took one small step forward and he lay down. Right there, on the ground in the open, the way he'd lain on the ground in that recovery enclosure more than 4 months ago, like no time had passed. Like whatever had existed between them in those early months wasn't something that needed to be rebuilt or recovered. It had simply been waiting, patient and unchanged, in the same place he'd left it. The other 2 appeared at the open gate a few minutes later. 2 came out first, cautious but not frightened, reading the scene with the careful attention I'd watched her develop over months. She took in first. She took in Buddy. She sat down near the gate and watched. Little 3 didn't come all the way out. He stood at the threshold, one hand on the gate frame, and he looked at Buddy from there. That was enough for him. That had always been enough for him. Nobody moved for a long time. When the habitat team finally, carefully guided first back through the gate, and he went without resistance, without drama, I stood where I was for another few minutes after the gate was secured. The staff around me were quiet. A few of them were not entirely composed, and I didn't hold that against anyone. I looked over at Daniel, who was standing a few feet to my right with his clipboard hanging at his side, completely forgotten. "You doing okay?" I asked him. He thought about it for a second. "I don't think I have a word for it," he said. I understood exactly what he meant. The seasons change differently when you work with animals. You don't mark time the way other people do, by calendars, by holidays, by the usual human anchors that divide one year from the next. You mark it by what you see, by who is bigger than they were, by what behaviors have emerged and which ones have faded, by the slow, patient accumulation of small moments that, taken together, tell you something true about the world. In the years that followed that afternoon at the East Gate, I watched 3 gorillas become something I could not have fully imagined on the morning I found Buddy lying in that recovery enclosure with 3 terrified infants pressed against his side. First became exactly what his name had always quietly suggested he would. He grew into the largest of the 3, broad across the shoulders, deliberate in his movements, with the kind of calm authority that develops in a young male gorilla who has never had reason to be afraid of his own size. He wasn't aggressive, he was simply certain. There's a difference, and it matters, and watching that certainty develop in an animal who had once pressed himself into a corner and gone still rather than face the world. I don't have a clinical term for what that felt like. I just know that it felt like something. 2 became the explorer. She was the one who always found the edges of any space she was given, who tested structures to their limits, who approached new enrichment with a directness that made the newer staff members nervous sometimes until they got used to her. She'd been the second to eat that day 6 weeks in, the second to climb, the second out of the gate on that Tuesday afternoon, always second but never far behind, and never hesitant once she'd decided. I watched her teach herself things. That sounds like an exaggeration. I watched her work at problems with a patience and persistence that humbled me regularly. Little 3 remained quiet. He always would, I think. Some animals carry their early experiences in their bodies in ways that never entirely resolve, not as damage, not as limitation, but as a kind of permanent attentiveness. He watched everything. He was the last to approach anything new and the first to understand it, and over time I came to think of his quietness not as a remnant of what he'd been through, but as simply the shape of who he was. He had chosen on that day at the threshold of the East Gate not to come all the way out. He had stood where he was and looked at Buddy from there and decided that was sufficient. That decision had always struck me as entirely his own, made entirely on his own terms. I respected it then. I respect it more now. Buddy got older. That's the part of this story I find hardest to write, not because it's unusual. Every living thing gets older, and everyone who works with animals understands that the arithmetic of lifespans is part of the work, but because Buddy was Buddy, and there is no way to describe what Buddy had been to this place and to the lives of the animals in it, that doesn't feel when you put it in plain language like an understatement. His muzzle went gray first, then the area around his eyes. He moved more slowly along the facility path in his afternoon circuits, stopping more often, settling into his favorite spots with the deliberate care of an older body that has learned to lower itself carefully. He still came to greet staff in the mornings. He still found his way to the various corners of the property he'd always favored. But the range shortened, and the pace slowed, and anyone who had known him for years could see the change even when they didn't speak about it. I started letting him rest more. I stopped worrying about whether he was getting enough activity, and started just making sure he was comfortable and warm when the nights cooled, and that there was always someone nearby when he wanted company. These were small adjustments. He accepted them without complaint, the way he accepted everything, with a kind of easy, uncomplicated grace that I have spent years trying to understand and still can't fully account for. It was about 2 years after the Eastgate afternoon that I noticed something I hadn't planned for, and couldn't have arranged if I'd tried. First had begun spending time near the edge of the habitat that faced the main facility path. Not always, not every day, but with a regularity that the staff had started to notice, and in the way that staff do when something moves them and they're not sure how to say so, had started mentioning to each other quietly without mentioning it to me directly, until Carla brought it up one afternoon with the careful, slightly sideways approach she always used when she thought something might be important. "Have you seen where First goes in the late afternoons?" she asked. I had seen it. I'd been watching it for 3 weeks without saying anything, for reasons I couldn't entirely explain. He would make his way to the northeast corner of the habitat, the corner closest to the path, and he would sit, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for longer. He sat with his back mostly toward the interior of the habitat, and his face toward the outside, toward the path, toward the old facility buildings beyond it. He wasn't agitated. He wasn't vocalizing or pacing or pressing against the barrier. He was just sitting, with the patient, present stillness that I had watched develop in him over years, looking out. Buddy still walked that path in the afternoons, more slowly now, and not every day, but on the days when he felt up to it he still made his slow circuit of the grounds, stopping at his usual spots, and the northeast corner of the habitat was along his route. I watched them one afternoon from a distance I thought was far enough to not intrude on anything. Buddy came around the curve in the path at his slow, considered pace and stopped when he reached the corner of the habitat. He stood there for a moment, the way older dogs stand when they're assessing whether lying down is the right decision yet. Then he lay down, on the outside of the barrier, about 3 feet from where First was sitting on the inside. Neither of them did anything. They didn't interact in any way that I could point to as an interaction. First didn't move toward the barrier. Buddy didn't try to push through it or call attention to himself. They simply occupied the same small piece of the afternoon, separated by a fence, and remained there together in a quiet that had no performance in it. No display, no demonstration, nothing that was meant for anyone watching. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the morning years ago when I'd come around a corner with a coffee I'd since forgotten to drink and found something I didn't have a category for. I thought about little 3 shifting in his sleep against Buddy's side. I thought about a piece of rope picked up and dropped 4 times in an empty enclosure. I thought about a hand resting on the ground 6 inches away from where another creature was lying, close enough to touch, not quite touching, and what that distance meant, and what crossing it would have cost, and why neither of them had needed to cross it to say what needed to be said. Some things don't require contact to be real. Some bonds don't require maintenance to remain intact. They exist in a register that is older than language and quieter than anything we usually pay attention to, and they persist, I think, not because the creatures involved have decided to maintain them, but because they were formed in a moment of genuine need, and genuine need leaves something behind that doesn't dissolve when the circumstances change. Buddy gave those infants something I couldn't give them, and nothing in our protocols could provide. He gave them the experience of being near a living creature that was not afraid, and in doing so he gave them permission to stop being afraid themselves. That's not a small thing. That is in some ways the only thing. The eating came from it, and the climbing came from it, and the playing came from it, and all of it, every milestone, every developmental benchmark, every afternoon that first spent growing into his certainty, came from a dog who walked through an unlatched gate one night and lay down on the ground and breathed slowly. He didn't know what he was doing. I believe that completely. He was just being where he wanted to be, near something living, in the uncomplicated way that had always characterized everything about him. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the most important things that happen between living creatures don't happen because someone planned them or understood them or was trying to accomplish something. Maybe they happen in the space between intention and accident, in the quiet hours when no one is watching and nothing is being documented, when one creature simply decides that the ground near another creature is a good place to lie down. Buddy passed on a Thursday morning in early spring, in his bed near the staff entrance, with the sun coming through the window the way it does at that hour, pale and unhurried, the kind of light that asks nothing of you. He was not alone. I sat with him for a long while after in the quiet of that morning, and I thought about everything he had been to this place without ever trying to be anything at all. I thought about what it means to leave a mark on the world through pure, uncalculated presence, through the simple willingness to lie down somewhere and stay. That afternoon first made his way to the northeast corner of the habitat. He sat in his usual spot and looked out toward the path for a long time. The path was empty. He stayed anyway. And somehow, in the way of things that cannot be explained but only witnessed, that seemed exactly right. That seemed like the only possible ending for a story that had never really been about endings at all but about what remains, what settles into the ground of a life and stays there, quiet and permanent, long after the moment that made it has passed. Some bonds are not about what you do. They are about where you chose to be, and Buddy had always known, without knowing that he knew it, exactly where that was.